I never considered myself someone who gets scared easily. I mean, sure, a good horror movie can make me jump, but that's just cheap thrills. Real life? That's different. I've always been able to brush things off, until last week. It was a late Tuesday night, probably around 11 p.m., and I was walking home from work. It wasn't the first time I'd walked back that late, so I didn't think anything of it. The streets were pretty empty, and the only sound was my footsteps hitting the pavement. You know how everything feels quieter at night? Like the world has gone to sleep, and it's just you? Yeah, it was like that. I was halfway home, scrolling through my phone to pass the time, when I spotted something strange out of the corner of my eye. A balloon, a bright red one, floating by itself, tied to a lamppost. I know it sounds ridiculous, but something about it made me stop in my tracks. It wasn't the kind of thing you expect to see just floating there in the middle of the night. It was so out of place, you know? No party stores nearby, no kids around, no reason for a balloon to be there, especially not at that hour. I stood there for a second, just staring at it. The street light above it flickered a couple of times, and I swear it made the balloon look, I don't know, creepier. The thing didn't move, didn't sway. It just floated perfectly still, like it was watching me or something. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. Get a grip, I muttered to myself. It's just a stupid balloon. So I kept walking, picking up the pace a little, but every few steps I glanced back over my shoulder. It was still there, tied to the lamppost, as if waiting for me to look back. When I turned the corner onto my street, I let out a breath I didn't even realize I was holding. I shook off the weird feeling and kept walking, but the thought of that balloon stuck with me. Why was it there? Why did it give me such a bad vibe? I was almost at my building when I saw it again. This time it was floating right outside my apartment complex. Same bright red balloon. Same unsettling stillness. My heart started to pound in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the air had gotten heavier, thicker. My stomach twisted, and for a second I thought I was going to be sick. Okay, this is getting weird, I whispered to myself. I looked around, expecting to see someone nearby. Maybe a kid who lost it or a prankster trying to freak me out, but there was no one. The street was completely empty. Just me and that balloon. I walked past it, trying not to look directly at it, like maybe if I ignored it, it would just disappear. But I could feel it there, like it was following me, even though it didn't move. My hands were shaking when I finally unlocked the door to my apartment building and rushed inside. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see it again. Once I was safely in my apartment, I tried to calm down. It's just a coincidence, I told myself. There's no way that's the same balloon from earlier. No way. I laughed a little, but it felt forced, hollow. I grabbed a glass of water, sat on the couch, and stared at the TV without really watching anything. But even though I was home, the image of that balloon wouldn't leave my head. Bright red, floating there in the dark, waiting, watching. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see it hovering just outside my window. That night after I saw the first balloon, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see it floating there, just hovering, perfectly still, and it made no sense. But I kept telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. After all, balloons are everywhere, right? I was being paranoid, or maybe I was just overtired from work. I tried convincing myself of all this, but deep down, something didn't feel right. The next morning, I forced myself to get up and go to work like usual. My rational mind had taken over again. Balloons don't follow people. It was just a random thing I'd seen. I got dressed, grabbed my bag, and headed out the door, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. As I stepped outside, the sun was already up, and everything seemed normal again. People were walking their dogs, cars were passing by, the usual morning stuff. It was comforting in a way. The weirdness of the previous night felt distant, like something I could forget about in the light of day. So I did my best to push it to the back of my mind. Work went by in a blur, which was honestly a good thing. I stayed busy, kept my head down, and avoided thinking about anything except what was right in front of me. But when lunchtime rolled around, I decided to step out and grab a sandwich from the deli around the corner. I was halfway down the street, my mind already on what I wanted to order, when I saw it again. A balloon. The same exact shade of red, just floating there in the middle of the sidewalk. This time it wasn't tied to anything. It just hovered a few feet off the ground, bobbing gently like it was waiting for me. I stopped dead in my tracks. My pulse quickened, and I felt that same cold dread creeping up my spine like the night before. It couldn't be the same balloon, right? It was broad daylight now. There were people walking around me, a bus rumbling by, life moving on like normal. But this balloon, it didn't fit. It didn't belong there, just like last night. I stood there for a second, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But the longer I stared at it, the worse that gnawing feeling in my gut got. It felt like it was mocking me, watching me. My mouth went dry, and I couldn't move. "Come on, man. It's just a balloon," I muttered to myself under my breath, trying to sound like I wasn't freaking out. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The rational part of my brain was struggling to come up with an explanation. Maybe someone dropped it. Maybe it's from a party nearby. But none of it felt right. I glanced around to see if anyone else noticed, but people were just walking by, completely ignoring it. I thought about asking someone if they saw it too, but I didn't want to sound like an idiot freaking out over a stupid balloon. So instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I turned around and walked away fast. I took a different route back to work, my mind racing the whole time. I didn't get lunch. I didn't even stop until I was back inside the office. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't focus for the rest of the day. I kept checking the window every few minutes, half expecting to see that balloon outside, floating there, waiting for me. When my shift finally ended, I almost didn't want to leave the building, but I had to go home. I couldn't stay there forever. So, I took a deep breath and stepped out into the evening air. It was still light out, but the shadows were already stretching long across the pavement. I walked as fast as I could, eyes scanning the street, trying to spot it before it spotted me. And then, just as I turned the corner to my street, there it was, the balloon, right outside my apartment building, floating in the same spot it had been last night. My heart dropped. I wasn't imagining it. It was the same balloon, the same shade of red, the same unsettling stillness, as if it was waiting for me. My head started to spin, and for a second I thought I might pass out. How was this happening? It was impossible. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at it, my body frozen. It wasn't tied to anything, wasn't drifting in the breeze. Just floating, watching. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to go near it, but I had to get inside. My apartment was just beyond it. Okay, I whispered to myself, trying to calm my racing heart. Just walk past it. It's fine. It's nothing. I swallowed hard and took a step forward. Then another. My feet felt like they were weighed down by concrete, but I forced myself to keep moving. I walked right past the balloon, refusing to look directly at it, my breath coming in short, shaky bursts. When I reached the front door, I practically threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely get my key into the lock. I didn't stop until I was in my apartment, leaning against the door, my chest heaving. I stood there for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. It took me a while to gather myself, but eventually I managed to walk over to the window. My hands were shaking as I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The balloon was still there, floating exactly where I had left it. This was no coincidence. This wasn't normal. It was following me. By the time I woke up the next morning, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept much, tossing and turning all night, waiting for something to happen. I kept imagining the balloon floating outside my window, watching me through the glass. I must have gotten a couple hours of sleep, but it wasn't enough to shake off the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The whole thing just kept looping in my head. Why was the balloon there? Why did it keep showing up? Was I going crazy? I didn't want to deal with it alone anymore, so I called my friend Jake. He was one of those guys who always had a level head, never freaked out over anything. I figured maybe if I told him about it, he'd either snap me out of it or help me figure out what was going on. Jake came over later that afternoon, and we sat in my living room, the curtains drawn. I didn't want to see outside, didn't want to know if the balloon was still out there. I told Jake everything, the balloon, how it followed me, how it kept showing up in my apartment and outside my work. At first he laughed. "Dude, seriously? You're freaking out over a balloon?" He shook his head like I was telling him a bad joke. "I'm not messing with you, Jake. This thing is not normal. It's been following me for 2 days now, and it's always the same one. Same color, same everything. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear I'm not imagining it. Jake leaned back in his chair, looking at me like he wasn't quite sure whether to believe me or not. "All right," he said slowly. "So, what do you think it is? You're telling me some evil balloon is stalking you?" I ran my hands through my hair, frustrated. "I don't know, man, but it's not just some random balloon. It's like it's watching me. I can feel it." Jake raised an eyebrow, his grin fading a bit. "Watching you? Well, like it's alive?" I shrugged, feeling stupid for even saying it out loud. "I don't know, but every time I see it, it's just there waiting, and no one else notices it. It's like I'm the only one who can see it." Jake stared at me for a second, then sighed. "All right, let's settle this. Show me the balloon. If it's still outside, I'll see it too, right?" I wasn't so sure. Something told me this thing wasn't going to make it that easy. But I nodded and led him to the door. My heart was pounding as I unlocked it and slowly pulled it open, half expecting to see the balloon hovering just outside. But the hallway was empty. No sign of it. I glanced back at Jake, who was watching me like I was losing my mind. "See," he said, smirking. "No balloon." I stepped outside, looking both ways down the street, but it was gone. I felt a weird mix of relief and frustration. I didn't know if I should be happy it wasn't there or worried that it would show up again when I least expected it. "Come on, man, let's go for a walk," Jake said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Get some fresh air. Clear your head. You'll feel better." I wasn't sure fresh air was going to fix whatever this was, but I agreed. We started walking down the block, the sun hanging low in the sky. It was one of those quiet afternoons where everything seemed peaceful. Normal. Like none of the craziness from the last couple of days had ever happened. But then, as we turned the corner onto the next street, I saw something that made my stomach twist. A kid, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing on the sidewalk with a balloon. A red balloon. I froze, my eyes locked on the balloon in the kid's hand. It was exactly like the one that had been following me. The same color, the same size, even the same stillness, like it wasn't affected by the breeze at all. Jake didn't notice at first. He was still talking about some basketball game he'd watched the night before, oblivious to the fact that my heart was racing. I nudged him, pointing at the kid. "Look," I said quietly. Jake turned and saw the kid, and he smiled. "What, the balloon? It's just a kid, dude. You're seriously freaking out over nothing." But I couldn't take my eyes off the balloon. The kid was just standing there, holding it tightly by the string, staring straight ahead like he wasn't aware of anything around him. There was something off about the whole thing, something I couldn't explain. I cleared my throat and forced myself to speak. "Hey, kid," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where'd you get the balloon?" The kid didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. He just stood there, gripping the string like his life depended on it. Jake stepped forward, squinting at the kid. "Hey, buddy, you hear my friend? Where'd you get that?" Still no response. The air around us felt heavy, like all the sound had been sucked out of the street. Even Jake seemed to feel it now. He stopped smiling and glanced at me, a little more serious. "Okay, this is kind of weird." I nodded, my throat dry. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to get closer to that balloon, didn't want to touch it or even be near it. But something inside me was screaming that this wasn't just a normal kid with a balloon. This was connected to everything that had been happening to me. I could feel it. The kid finally moved. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his expression was completely blank. No fear, no curiosity, just emptiness. "Who gave you the balloon?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The kid blinked once, slowly, and then, without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the alley at the end of the block. The balloon bobbed behind him, following as if it had a mind of its own. Jake stood there next to me, speechless for once. Neither of us moved for a long time. I didn't have any answers, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. After that encounter with the kid, things started spiraling out of control. The balloon wasn't just something that appeared every once in a while anymore. It was everywhere. I couldn't escape it. No matter where I went, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the red balloon was always there, lurking in the corner of my eye, like some kind of constant shadow. It started small. The day after we saw the kid, I went to the grocery store just trying to live my life like nothing weird was happening. But as I was grabbing some milk from the cooler, I caught a glimpse of red in the reflection of the glass door. I whipped around, and there it was, floating near the entrance of the store. The same bright red, perfectly round balloon, just hanging in the air like it was waiting for me. I felt a rush of panic, but I tried to play it cool. I left my cart behind and walked straight out, not even bothering to pay for anything. I thought that maybe it was just bad luck, that maybe the balloon had just shown up again by chance. But as the days went by, it started happening more and more often. I'd see it outside my apartment building every morning when I left for work, hovering just above the ground, like it was tied to an invisible string. At first, it would be a few blocks away, but the closer I got to it, the more I realized it was getting closer too. Each day, it inched nearer, like it was closing in on me. Then it started showing up in places where it shouldn't have been able to. I'd see it floating outside the windows of my office building, 6 stories up, as if it had no concern for gravity. I'd catch it out of the corner of my eye while I was driving, bobbing along beside the car in my peripheral vision. Even at night, when I was trying to sleep, I'd hear faint tapping on my window, and when I gathered the courage to look, I'd see the red balloon bumping softly against the glass, as though it was trying to get inside. I stopped telling Jake about it. After the encounter with the kid, he hadn't seemed as confident that I was just imagining things, but he also didn't have any solutions. He kept trying to reassure me, saying things like, "It's probably just some creepy prank. Maybe someone's messing with you." But he didn't sound sure of himself anymore, and I could tell he was starting to worry too. Still, I didn't want to drag him further into whatever this was. I was starting to feel like I was the one it was after, and I didn't want him involved. Things reached a breaking point a few nights later. I was lying in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. I hadn't been able to sleep for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the balloon nearby, as if it was hovering just outside my door waiting. I was too afraid to go to the window, too afraid to even check the peephole in case it was floating in the hallway. The whole apartment felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me, and I couldn't take it anymore. That's when I heard the knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft, almost gentle tap-tap-tap on my door. But in the dead silence of my apartment, it sounded like a gunshot. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, convinced that I had imagined it. But then it came again, a little louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. I slowly sat up, every muscle in my body tense. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what was on the other side of that door. But I couldn't just sit there, waiting for it to break in. My apartment was small, and the door was only a few steps away. I could hear the faint tapping continuing, like whoever or whatever was on the other side was growing impatient. I forced myself to get up and walk to the door. My hands were trembling as I reached for the peephole. I pressed my eye against the cold metal, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And there it was, the red balloon, floating inches from the door, its smooth surface glowing faintly in the dim hallway light. There was no string, no one holding it, just the balloon, bobbing gently in the air, like it had found me at last. I stumbled back, my heart racing, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't just stay here, trapped in my apartment with that thing outside. But where could I go? If I ran, it would follow me. I was sure of it. I had no idea what it wanted or why it was here, but I knew one thing. It wasn't going to leave me alone. That's when I heard something else. A faint voice, muffled but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. "Don't open the door." I blinked, unsure if I had imagined it. The voice was soft, almost like a whisper, but it sounded like it was coming from the hallway. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. "Don't open it," the voice repeated, a little louder this time. "Please, it's not safe." I backed away, my mind racing. Who was out there? Was this another trick? Or was someone actually trying to help me? I debated with myself for what felt like an eternity, the knocking now steady, as if the balloon was growing impatient. Finally, I made a decision. I had to see who was out there. If someone was trying to warn me, I needed to know why. I reached for the handle and, with shaking hands, slowly opened the door. At first, I didn't see anyone. The hallway was empty, except for the balloon, which was still floating inches from the threshold. But then, out of the shadows, stepped the kid, the same boy Jake and I had seen before. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, and he was staring at the balloon like it was something dangerous. "You shouldn't have opened it," he whispered, his voice trembling. I stood there, frozen, staring at him. What is this? What's happening?" I asked, my voice barely more than a croak. The boy shook his head, glancing nervously at the balloon. "It's not what it seems. It wants you to let it in." I swallowed hard, trying to understand. What does it want from me? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked at me with those wide, terrified eyes and said, "It's waiting for you to let go." The kid's words hung in the air like a warning, and I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine. "It's waiting for you to let go." What did that even mean? Let go of what? The door? My sanity? My grip on reality? None of it made sense. And yet, standing there in the hallway with that balloon inches from me, I felt an overwhelming dread creeping into every part of my body. I stepped back, my eyes flicking between the kid and the balloon, trying to make sense of what was happening. The boy was pale, his eyes hollow and wide, but there was something about him that made me trust what he was saying, even though none of this was logical. I could feel that whatever he was warning me about wasn't just a prank or some childish game. It was something darker. "Why is it following me?" I asked, my voice shaky, barely able to form the words. "Why me?" The kid didn't answer right away. He glanced nervously at the balloon, which was floating unervingly close to the door, bobbing softly, as if waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move. Then the boy looked back at me, his voice low and full of fear. "It chooses people. People like you. People who notice." Notice what? I was growing desperate for answers, my frustration mixing with the fear. "I didn't do anything. I just saw it." He shook his head slowly. "That's the problem. Once you see it, once you pay attention, it doesn't leave you alone. It wants you to let go." "Let go of what?" I asked again, my voice rising in panic. "What does it want me to do?" The boy opened his mouth to speak but stopped, his eyes suddenly widening with terror. He took a step back, retreating further into the shadows of the hallway. I turned to look at what had scared him, and my breath caught in my throat. The balloon was closer. It hadn't moved when I was watching it, but now it was hovering directly in the doorway, slowly drifting toward me. The string, if it even had one, was invisible, and the balloon seemed to glide on its own like it was being drawn toward me by something I couldn't see or understand. Panic surged through me. My instincts screamed at me to shut the door, to run, to get away from this thing, but my feet were frozen to the spot. The balloon was inches away now, its bright red surface shining softly in the dim light. I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating. I took a step back into my apartment, heart racing, but the balloon followed. There was no wind, no draft, and yet it floated forward, crossing the threshold like it was following me, hunting me. The boy's words echoed in my head. "It's waiting for you to let go." I had no idea what I was supposed to do. Part of me wanted to grab it, to throw it out of the apartment, to make it disappear, but another part of me knew that touching it would be a mistake. I could feel the wrongness of it, the malevolence radiating from it. Behind me, the boy's voice broke through my thoughts. "Don't let it touch you. Once it gets too close, it's too late." I stumbled back further, feeling the wall on my back. There was nowhere else to go. I was trapped in my own apartment, and the balloon was closing in. Its bright red surface seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain, and the air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't see but could definitely feel. Suddenly, without thinking, I grabbed a coat hanging from the nearby chair and swung it toward the balloon. The fabric hit it, but the balloon didn't pop or even move like I expected. Instead, it just hovered there unaffected, as though it was immune to whatever I was trying to do. "What do I do?" I yelled, turning toward the boy, hoping for some kind of instruction, anything that could help me get out of this. "You have to get rid of it," the boy said, his voice trembling. "But you can't destroy it, not like that. It won't go away unless you give it to someone else." "Give it to someone else?" I repeated, horrified. "You mean pass it on?" The kid nodded, his face pale. "That's the only way. That's how it works. Once you notice it, it stays with you unless you give it to someone else. But once you do, they're stuck with it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Pass it on? Like some kind of cursed object? No, I can't do that. I can't just. You have to, the boy interrupted, his voice urgent. If you don't, it'll never leave you alone. It'll keep following you, getting closer and closer until. His voice trailed off, and I didn't need him to finish. I knew what he meant. If I didn't find a way to get rid of it, the balloon would keep closing in on me, and eventually, it would take me, just like it had taken whoever had passed it on to me. I felt sick. My stomach twisted at the thought of handing this nightmare off to someone else. But what other choice did I have? The balloon was right in front of me now, floating ominously, as if daring me to make a decision. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. There had to be another way. I couldn't just give this to someone else. Couldn't condemn them to the same terror that had been haunting me for days. But if I didn't? I looked around the room, my eyes darting from the balloon to the door, to the boy standing in the hallway. His eyes were filled with fear, but also with a strange kind of understanding, like he'd been through this before. I'm sorry, he said softly. There's no other way. The balloon drifted closer, and I felt the cold weight of inevitability settle over me. I had to make a choice, and I had to make it now. But before I could think about it any longer, something inside me snapped. I grabbed the nearest object, a book, my keys, I didn't even know, and threw it at the balloon, hoping against hope that it would somehow stop this thing. But it didn't work. The balloon kept floating forward, inch by inch, relentless and unstoppable. I stumbled back into the living room, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. There was no time left. The balloon was almost touching me now, its surface inches from my face. And then, in a moment of pure desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I reached out and grabbed the string. Instantly, the world seemed to shift around me. The air grew colder, and I felt a strange sensation ripple through my body, like something had latched onto me, something dark and impossible to understand. The boy's voice echoed in my mind one last time. It's waiting for you to let go. The moment my fingers closed around the string, it felt like the air in the room changed. It wasn't just cold, it was freezing. I could feel the chill sinking into my bones, and for a split second, it was as if the entire world had stopped. The sound of my breathing echoed in my ears, loud and ragged, but everything else was silent. Time seemed to stretch out, making every second feel like an eternity. The balloon didn't move, but I could feel its weight now. It was heavy, heavier than any balloon should be, like it wasn't made of air at all, but something far more dense and sinister. I tried to pull my hand back, but my grip had locked onto the string as if I couldn't let go even if I wanted to. The boy's voice echoed in my head again, over and over. It's waiting for you to let go. The boy stood in the hallway, his face pale, his eyes locked on me. He hadn't moved, and his expression was a mix of pity and fear. It's too late, he whispered, as if he could sense what was happening. Once you hold it, there's no going back. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was saying. No going back? What did that mean? I stared at the balloon, my heart pounding in my chest, and I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The balloon wasn't just following me. It wasn't random. It was waiting for me, yes, but it was more than that. It was part of me now, or maybe I was part of it. I could feel it, like a presence inside me, a cold, creeping force that was slowly spreading through my body. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, and all that came out was a strangled whisper. What does it want? The boy took a step closer, his eyes filled with sorrow. It wants to take you. That's how it works. It latches onto you, waits until you're weak, until you grab it. And once you do, it pulls you into wherever it came from. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. But why me? I asked, my voice shaking. Why did it choose me? The boy looked away, as if he couldn't bear to answer. But finally, he spoke. It chooses people who notice it. People who see things that others don't. That's why it started following you. Because you noticed. My heart sank. That was it. I had noticed the balloon, paid attention to it when no one else had. It was so simple, but that's what had triggered everything. I had let my curiosity get the better of me, and now I was paying the price. I stood there, still gripping the string, feeling the weight of the balloon pulling me down, like it was dragging me into something dark and endless. The boy was right. It was too late. I could feel the pull growing stronger, and the more I resisted, the tighter my grip on the string became. But there was something else, something the boy hadn't said, but I could sense it. The balloon wasn't just waiting for me to let go. It was waiting for me to make a choice. I could let it take me, disappear into whatever place it came from, or I could do what the boy had hinted at earlier. I could pass it on. The thought made me sick to my stomach. Pass it on? To someone else? Condemn another person to the same fate? The idea was horrifying, but the balloon was relentless. The cold inside me was spreading, numbing my fingers, my arms, my chest. I didn't have much time left. I can't do it, I whispered, more to myself than to the boy. I can't give this to someone else. The boy stared at me, his face unreadable. You don't have a choice, he said softly. It's either you or someone else. That's the only way to break free. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. How could I do this? How could I pass this curse on to another person, knowing what it would do to them? But then I thought of the alternative. If I didn't, I would be gone. I would vanish, just like the boy's sister had, or whoever had passed it to me. And then someone else would notice the balloon eventually, and the cycle would start all over again. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. The cold was unbearable now, but I knew I had to act fast. I couldn't live with this thing haunting me for the rest of my life, but I also couldn't live with the guilt of passing it on to someone innocent. Then, an idea struck me. What if I give it back? I asked, my voice trembling. What if I give it to you? The boy's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, he seemed unsure of what to say. You can't, he stammered. It doesn't work that way. I've already been touched by it. It's already left me. I stared at him, my mind racing. But if I pass it back to you, maybe it'll break the cycle. Maybe it'll end this. The boy shook his head, stepping back. No, you don't understand. But before he could finish, I made my move. With all the strength I had left, I shoved the balloon toward him, releasing the string from my frozen fingers. The second it left my hand, I felt a rush of warmth flood back into my body, and I gasped for air as if I had been drowning and was finally able to breathe again. The balloon drifted toward the boy, its red surface glowing faintly in the dim light of the hallway. He stepped back, his face a mask of terror, but the balloon followed him, as if drawn to him once more. No, he whispered, shaking his head. No, please. But it was too late. The balloon hovered in front of him, and as he reached out instinctively to push it away, his fingers brushed the string. For a moment, everything went still. The boy stood there, frozen, his hand on the string, his eyes wide with shock. And then, in an instant, he was gone. The balloon floated down to the floor, deflated, crumpled like it had never been full of anything at all. I stood there in the silence, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The boy was gone, the balloon was gone, and for the first time in days, I felt free. But even as I stood there, catching my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The balloon was gone for now, but I knew, deep down, that somewhere, someday, someone would notice it again, and the cycle would begin all over.